right. Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our the Marmoteers Guide to Marmots webinar. I am Laura Trefethen, the Executive Director of the nonprofit WildAware. And I would also like to introduce our president and founder, Christy Green. She's here.
Hi.
She may occasionally jump on occasionally and is also helping to monitor the chat. And WildAware's mission is to help create a respectful coexistence between people and wildlife, and we're based in Evergreen, Colorado. Encourage you, let me show you this right here, a second. Um, we encourage you to please check out our website at wildaware.org. And if you have any questions, always reach out to info@wildaware.org for future comments, questions, or things you'd like to see on these type of webinars. So we're excited to bring you this webinar today. Um, Thank you for joining us. Let me introduce our awesome speakers. So first we have, here it is, Taylor Bastian. She is a PhD candidate from the UCLA Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And let me put my notes right here. And she is studying social behavior there, and her research with the marmot system focuses on the causes and impacts of social plasticity. So, and then next we have Katie Adler. Katie is also a PhD candidate at the University of California in LA, and her current research leverages over 20 years of observational and experimental data to
Sure.
understand how marmot behavior shifts in response to human disturbance. And if everyone else could mute, here, I'll move that person. Here we go. Um, Broadly, she's interested in intersecting wildlife behavior and the human dimensions of conflict as a means to inform equitable management and facilitate human-wildlife coexistence. So, WildAware, we're very excited to welcome these wildlife researchers and self-proclaimed marmoteers today as they share fun facts and field stories, latest science about these adorable mountain neighbors that we have. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And if they don't get addressed during the presentation, we'll have time at the end to go over it. So take it away, Taylor, and thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Super excited to be here and share with you a little bit about our current work with the marmots. So let me find, there we are. Um, so First of all, you might be thinking we have kind of two random people here talking to us about marmots. What even is a marmot? What does that look like? And we're super excited to share that with you. You all being from Colorado, or at least being aware of WildAware, might be a little bit more familiar, but you might have a couple of questions. So first of all, a marmot is a very large ground squirrel. Most ground squirrels are kind of in the realm of like maybe 6 to 12 inches, as well being like a large one. Marmots can get up to like 6 or 7 kilograms, so they are quite large. The adults are at least, and they are obligate hibernators, which means that similar to a lot of other mammals that live in kind of mountainous areas, instead of being able to eat and stay awake throughout the winter, marmots actually require to completely shut down their systems. Their intestines and their brains go into this trance-like state where they are completely out of it for about 7 months out of the year, which means that a lot of their life they have to focus on how am I going to survive hibernation. They are also facultatively social, which means that sometimes they like to have friends and live in groups, but sometimes they like to be completely on their own, which is a really unique thing that not a lot of species are facultatively social. So humans, for example, are obligately social. We're really not good at being a solo human in the middle of the woods somewhere. So it's really interesting to be able to have these species that are really driven by hibernation and survival, and also trying to make sure they are being social sometimes. So where do marmots live? Similar to the area that, Evergreen is already in, marmots live in alpine and subalpine environments. So they really like to live on mountains, especially kind of facing outward from a mountain face. These tend to be really like kind of rocky faces where they can see a lot of things. We'll talk a little bit about their predation pressures, and so it's really important for them to be able to see what's going on around them. They also live underground, so they live in burrows, and they often actually inherit burrows or steal burrows from other animals. Marmots are not great diggers, which is funny because they live underground, but they'll often live in either past marmot burrows, and then they'll expand little by little with their minimal digging skills, or they'll take over like fox dens, things like that, which causes this kind of really interesting thing where oftentimes foxes and predators can fit into marmot burrows because they're not marmot size. They're made by another species. What do marmots eat? Marmots are interesting. They are vegetarians, they are herbivores, they will eat kind of whatever food is available to them. So they're not all that picky. They love flowers, they love grasses, any vegetation that's on and around the ground. They actually don't drink water. So marmots get all of the water that they need from the vegetation that they eat, but that leaves them sometimes missing a little bit of the nutrients and the electrolytes that they might want, which means sometimes you'll find them licking rocks or dirt or things like that, solely because they're limited in some of the nutrients that they can get from this vegetation. So you'll especially see we like to feed our marmots some dandelions early in the season because they really do like those bright colors and those kind of nutrient dense flowers. So, what do marmots even do all day? Their main goals are just to eat and try to survive, which you might think that's pretty similar to all wild animals. But marmots have a couple of specific pressures that they face that are kind of unique. So, the baseline is that it's actually kind of tough to be a marmot. So, if you're a marmot, you are constantly on the lookout for predators. The marmots that we study in and around Gothic, which we'll get to in a second, face really strong predation pressure, especially from foxes right now, but also things like coyotes, sometimes mountain lions or wolves in the past, things like red-tailed hawks and other raptors. There's a lot of predation that happens, and so I mean, even though they're big for a rodent, they're still relatively small and really do need to be on the lookout for any predation. They also are not all that great at figuring out kind of how warm they need to be. So the adults are better at thermoregulation, but still, marmots do not like to be too warm. They can get heat stressed very easily, which means they're under threat from predation. They're under stress from being too hot, which leads them to be underground a good amount of the time. They're also at threat from being too cold sometimes. So while they're better at handling the cold than the cold can really impact how healthy they can be over the winter. So if there's not enough snowpack, then it's not insulating enough and they could freeze to death during their winter hibernation. They also are at risk from things like drought and lack of resources, just like any animal can be. While marmots tend to always have enough food around because there's always grass around, there still can be years where there's droughts or lack of growing season time limits the amount of time they're able to eat and stock up for hibernation. In fact, we have a quote in National Geographic from the Marmot team that is, "It's get fat or die," which is very much true for these hibernators. If they can't gain enough mass for the winter, then they are very much in trouble for their ability to survive this winter hibernation. And so that means that even things like having a really large litter or having too many babies can be a lot of energetic stress on these marmots, which of course they need to do that to be able to be fit and advantageous. However, if they spend too much time focused on weaning their offspring, then they might not have enough time to gain enough weight and survive the winter. So it's all this very tightrope balancing act for marmots. And because of this, marmots actually are a really great system to ask a lot of questions. And I do mean a lot of questions, right? Given their unique relationship with being social and with their environments that change very drastically and their need to hibernate, we have all of these questions about interacting with humans and the environment and what kind of traits that they have that we can really learn a lot from these animals, which leads us to the Marmot Project. So the Marmot Project in and around Gothic, Colorado, I apologize, I'm not sure why that picture's not showing up, but was started in 1962 by Ken Armitage at UCLA, and it's now now it's been inherited by Katie and I's advisor, Dan Blumstein, and it's actually the second longest wild mammal study in the world, second only to Jane Goodall's chimps, meaning that we have decades and decades of information and data that we can use to answer those questions in the slide before. So we actually have 65 years of data from almost 5,000 marmots, over 11 colony sites, and not including a couple of satellites, from hundreds of researchers and almost two, oh gosh, million total minutes of observing, which is so much data. And it's truly a rare amount of data to have over these animals from the day that they emerge from their natal burrow, from the day that they emerge into the world as babies, to often the days that they disperse or die. And they're individually marked, meaning that we have so much really cool information. This is in and around Gothic, Colorado, which means that it is all around this field station. And so we know exactly where these marmots live and what they're up to, and we're able to use that to answer a lot of really cool questions. These are some obligatory cute little marmot photos. But using this data set, we're able to answer a lot of really cool questions, and Katie is going to tell you a little bit now about how we actually collect those data. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Katie to tell us about kind of the methodology of the Marmot Project.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. That was really a really great introduction. Give me just a moment to get myself together. Okay. Yeah, so I'll be talking a bit about the methods of marmoteering. So in order to learn all these amazing things about marmots, we have to go out and study them, right? Like Taylor was saying. Our study, like Taylor said, has been running for over 60 years now, and we've collected a ton of data on different attributes of marmot physiology, behavior, and health. We have two primary methods of studying marmots that I'll be talking more about, as well as some field experiments, and some cool things that we actually just started doing this year. So what does a day in the life of a marmoteer look like? We normally split up our day doing observations of behavior and trapping. Our goal is to observe the marmots at all times that they're above ground every day for their entire lives. And while that's not obviously attainable, we do get pretty close. We watch marmots during their active periods, usually right after the sun comes up until late morning, and then again in the late afternoon. Marmots typically go underground during the hottest parts of the day, which means we also get a nice break during that time as well. And in my opinion, one of the best perks about studying marmots is that they don't really come out in bad weather, which means we don't have to come out in bad weather either. So if it's raining or if it's really hot, they get to go home, which means there's nothing out for us to study, which means that we get a couple extra breaks here and there. So when we're out watching the marmots, what kind of things are we looking for? We watch the marmots using either binoculars or spotting scopes, which help us see them from a distance. We normally stay pretty far away to avoid interfering with their natural behaviors, but some of the marmots, especially the ones that live at the field station, are really, really habituated, and so they let us get really close. So there's a marmot that's a fan favorite. Her name is Tree, who always lets us get really close. Like we can get 5 feet away from her before she like actually runs away. But that's pretty abnormal because she actually lives at a colony that has no people at it, like very little human influence. So it's pretty variable, but typically that's not the case. So she's pretty unique and special in that way. So since 2002, 2003, we've been recording marmot social behaviors, and that could be positive behaviors like playing, grooming one another, or greeting one another, or that could be something like an aggressive behavior like fighting or snarling, and we can usually hear that from pretty far away. They're pretty loud. Marmots typically display more positive behaviors and aggressive ones as well. So we're typically seeing those blending behaviors pretty frequently. And by recording who's interacting with who, we can get a sense of how relationships are distributed across a colony and within social groups. And Taylor and I will both be talking about that because both of our research is on that. So marmots are usually really social right after they emerge from hibernation. And then once pups emerge, the pups are also super playful. We really enjoy watching them interact, but you can imagine it gets really hard to write everything down when you have 5 pups playing with each other, and you have to write down as much as possible about who's wrestling who or who's biting who, and try and get all of those interactions. And we do that for about 4 hours in the morning, like I said, and 2 hours in the afternoon. And so it can get pretty tiring, but it is pretty fun. And then other than social behavior, we record a lot of other behaviors. We record bouts of alarm calling, which is a behavior that marmots do to alert others of threats. They make this super high-pitched noise that you can hear from pretty far away, and that's why they have the nickname whistle pig. I'm hoping this is going to play. If it doesn't, look it up on your own. Not sure if that played, but anyway, great.
We can see the video, but there was no sound coming through. So
That's okay.
Yeah.
Just look it up on your own. It's a really distinct noise that you can hear from like really far away. But it's super loud up close when you're doing these trapping observations. We also do detailed recordings of foraging so that we can track how much time marmots allocate to looking around for predators during foraging bouts. And marmots also do a lot of scent marking, so we track that too. Like Taylor was saying, we like to get a sense of the predation pressure that marmots might experience across our colonies. And so we also log whenever we see marmot predators at our colonies. That could be things like foxes, coyotes, or red-tailed hawks. A teammate of mine actually got to see a badger at one of our sites, which is super rare and really cool since they're mostly nocturnal, but those are pretty gnarly predators of marmots. They can dig into the burrows and actually like get them versus like these other predators kind of have to be opportunistic and get them when they're outside of the burrows. Sometimes we also run experiments during observation sessions. So as prey species, marmots have to make decisions about when to flee from threats, whether it's worth it to keep foraging or resting for a few extra seconds while the threat approaches. It's often a choice of, do I want to wait a little bit longer to eat more so I can get fatter? Or should I run back to my burrow now and guarantee that I won't get eaten? So individuals have to make a lot of different decisions about this, and it's something that we want to study. So we do this field experiment called a flight initiation distance, or FID experiment, where essentially we walk towards a marmot at a constant pace and record how close the marmot allows us to approach before it flees. And while we're not necessarily perceived as predators, we do think that they perceive us as like some sort of new potential threat. And so we can measure how bold the marmots are by how close they let us get. So we do these observations, but how do we actually know who is who? So each marmot has a unique symbol that we use to identify them from far away using spotting scopes. You can think of it kind of like their name. We try to make the symbols simple so they're easy to see and easy to draw. So for example, the one on the left is Dan's hat, which is based on our advisor's cowboy hat that he wears sometimes. And lemon is on the right. You can't really see the whole mark, but it's basically just like a lemon slice. So we try to make them really unique so that we don't mix up two individuals, which can lead to some creative freedom. I have a cute picture of one later on in this presentation that you'll probably enjoy. And we place the symbol on them during trapping sessions. So we trap marmots at our colonies every day in order to get data that we couldn't get from just observing them from afar. Similar to observations, our goal is to trap every marmot in the study every 2 weeks. That's not always feasible. We sometimes like to say that certain marmots are choosing not to participate in our research, which can be kind of frustrating sometimes, but it's all consensual. They choose to go in the traps, and sometimes they don't choose to go in the traps, and that's okay. Yeah, so for trapping, we place live traps at the entrances of burrows in the morning before the marmots emerge from the day and put bait in the back to entice them to go in. We've tried using a couple different bait options, but recently we use a lot of horse feed or oats, peanut butter, vanilla, and salt to get them super interested. And it's been smelling really good. Like as someone who would not eat it, it does smell good. We leave the traps open for a few hours and then check whether we've caught anyone before it gets too warm or if it starts raining. We want to check all the traps to keep everyone safe. And once we caught an animal, we coax it into this bag that kind of mimics a burrow. The picture I have on the right is the kind of bag we use. And when the marmots are interested in going in, they go straight into the bag, and the bag gets smaller as they go further in. And so it kind of straitjackets them in so they can't wiggle around, which keeps them safe. And it also keeps us safe too. So once they're in the bag, we work quickly to get them released as soon as possible. We give every marmot unique ear tags that have either 4 or 5 digits numbers on them, and that helps us identify exactly who they are. So sometimes the marks might fade or they might look somewhat similar to one another. And so the ear tags are the most fail-safe way of identifying an individual when we're working with them directly. After we've confirmed the individual's identity, we weigh them and take measurements of their hind feet to understand how they grow throughout the season. We take a lot of different samples and measurements. We also take a small amount of blood to understand immune function by looking at white blood cells, and we take swabs of their cheeks to examine their DNA. We collect fecal samples if they're so kind as to provide us with those as well. And we use those to understand stress and cortisol. Once we've collected all of these samples, it's time to paint the mark. So we use a non-toxic fur dye and a toothbrush to mark their backs with these unique symbols. If you can see the one on the right, that one's one from this year. Its name is Fart. And we, like I said, take some creative freedom with some of these marks. So that's just one of many very interesting marks that we have this year in particular. We try to make them as big as possible on their backs, but you can imagine that a squirming marmot is really hard to mark, right? So sometimes we say they look like potatoes. There's only so much we can do. And then we release them and then they run back to their burrows and are happy and healthy and all good. Something new and exciting that we've actually started doing this year is camera trapping. So we've started placing motion sensor cameras at burrows around our colonies to give us an up close and personal look at marmots that we couldn't actually get from observing them from far away. And in doing that, we get to see what marmots are up to when we're not around. We hope that we can use these videos that we get from the cameras to train an AI model that will identify social behaviors and potentially could identify individuals. So if it's able to identify unique individuals, we want to learn what aspects of marmots it's actually using to know who is who, like what, maybe it's their posture, maybe it's some sort of aspect of their behavior. So we're trying to learn how we can use that to identify individuals. And this project is really in its very early stages, like it was just started this year. So, but we're optimistic that it will open a new avenue of research where we can ask pretty cool questions about the marmots. And so I've breeze through all of these methods. There's a lot of different things that we do on a day-to-day basis. We like to say that we're at capacity with all of the work that we do. And I personally think that that's pretty true. I think Taylor would also attest to that. It's pretty incredible how much data we can collect in a season. And this work really wouldn't be possible without a massive team. And we're always super grateful for our undergrads and volunteers that come to work with us. Like Taylor said, we've had hundreds of people work on this project. And everyone works really, really hard. And I'm pretty proud of the work that we've done over my last 3 field seasons. So just a big shout out to all the other Marmoteers from this and past years. That's it. I will give it back over to Taylor for the next steps.
All right, fantastic. So we're getting so many wonderful questions about the marmots on here. So that's a basic overview of the Marmot project as a whole. So that's the data that we're collecting, the things that we get to learn, the things that we get to learn about. And all of these data that we collect, we're able to ask really cool questions with. So Katie and I are both now going to share a little bit about the research that we do as individuals with this data that we've collected. So my work, if you might remember what we were talking about at the beginning with the introductions, is the idea of social plasticity. So kind of why individuals would behave differently than they usually do. And so the basis of this is that whether you live alone or with a group, and whether you're a marmot or a human, it's kind of a jungle out there. It's kind of hard to survive on your own. You might run into things like predators. You might have fires and storms and adverse conditions. You might run into drought or lack of resources, and you might even run into other animals that do not want you around, right? And so it's often better if you have a social group around. Your social group can help you build shelters. They can share innovations like fires and share resources with you. They can even alert you when predators are around. So it often is a good idea to have a social group. Sometimes, right? Because whether you're a marmot or something else, living in a group can have a lot of costs. So if you're in a bigger group, predators might hear or see you a lot easier. You're going to have to share your food, whether there's a lot of food or not. There might be stress associated with figuring out who's in charge here, who gets to tell us what to do. And the more individuals you interact with, the more likely you are to catch a disease from them. So sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. Overall, it is different if you have social group. And that really depends on the context that you're around. And this can also be really important because individuals will change their social behavior over their lifetime. Maybe you're a really social individual as a kid, and then you grow up and you're a little bit more introverted, something like that. And changing your behavior from your past patterns can have really big consequences. We can kind of think about this like a human neighborhood, right? I like to think of the marmots as a little bit more human than they probably are. But if we have a human neighborhood, we might have a really friendly neighbor who's always saying hello and bringing cookies and things like that, and a very grumpy neighbor who's always kind of sitting on his porch and not really saying hello to anybody. And that's kind of a consistent personality difference between these two individuals that in my research we call an among individual difference. It's a difference among these two different people that is really consistent. We can always predict, Our friendly neighbor is going to be friendly, and our grumpy neighbor is going to be grumpy. And if we have that context, we can look over somebody's lifetime and say, all right, over their lifetime, they are consistently engaging in these social patterns and social relationships, right? But sometimes individuals will act in a way that is weird for them. And that means that we're able to kind of point out differences where, oh, our friendly neighbor suddenly disappeared from our social scene. Where did she go? And that lets us ask really cool questions like, what's going on there? Is she sick? Is she busy? Does she just hate you? Why isn't she coming to your birthday party? Things like that. And so this difference in this individual over time is called a within individual. It's just within me, where usually I'm one way and suddenly I'm acting in a different way from what I usually do. And so that could be thought of as flexibility or unpredictability, right? And this is important because similar behaviors, or even the exact same behavior, not going to the neighborhood barbecue, might have completely different consequences based off of your average patterns, right? So if our grumpy neighbor doesn't show up to the barbecue, we might think, yeah, he wasn't going to come anyways, right? But if our friendly neighbor who came to everybody else's barbecue doesn't come to ours, maybe we're worried about her. Maybe we're going to bring her soup. Maybe we're angry at her because we think that she's being mean to us. So these consequences can be very, very different just based off of what we know of these individuals already. And so, with this type of thought, we're able to ask questions using the marmot data set like, am I more or less friendly than the other marmots around me? When should I change my social behavior? And will changing that behavior help me or will it hurt me? And we use this using the observational data that Katie talked really well about, where we write down every single social interaction these marmots have with each other because we know them by name. And in doing so, we can form this thing called social networks, where we have these bonds between individuals, where the larger the bond is, that means the more they've interacted. And we're also able to tell who's starting these interactions. So that lets us come up with social network attributes or just traits, such as how many friends do I have? Do I have four? Do I have five? Is that more or less than the others around me? How many times am I starting interactions with others versus how many times are others coming up to me? You can kind of think of that again in a human term of like, does it matter how many texts you send out to people versus how many people text you first? There might be slightly different social consequences of that. We also might look at something like, am I important in my community? If we were to remove this marmot from their social network, are they still in community with each other, or does it completely fracture into many different social groups? I apologize. There does seem to be a garbage truck right outside of my apartment right now. We're going to continue working with that. And so with the marmot data, what we did is we fit statistical models that I'm happy to talk about in more detail if you're interested in it, where we looked at if you remember our human neighborhood, their personalities, their lifetime averages of a social network trait, as well as their flexibility. So each year, if they are acting in a way that is different or weird based off of their personality. And we looked at how those contribute to their winter survival, which if you remember is very much driven by hibernation, their summer survival, which is largely driven by predation, and if they're able to spot and avoid predators, as well as their odds of reproducing, and if they do reproduce, how many babies they had that year. So what did we find with our grumpy little marmot? This one's name is Bree. So we found that marmots, and especially females, survive a lot better when they start acting unpredictably, which is a very unusual result. So you can take a look at this graph here. It's a little bit confusing, where on the y-axis we have how likely I am to survive the summer, and on the x-axis we have how influential or how important I am to my community compared to on average. So you can see that in this middle here along this line, that is when I am my average influence. I have the same amount of friends that I usually have, right? And the further I go to the right or to the left, the higher likelihood I have of surviving. So if I usually have five friends and I have five friends in this year too, I have maybe an 80% chance of survival. But if I all of a sudden have 10 friends, I'm getting a lot more likely to survive. And if I all of a sudden have seven friends, or if I all of a sudden have two friends, I'm also a lot more likely to survive, which is kind of weird. And it indicates that being unpredictable really actually helps in this marmot system. So it doesn't matter whether you're a grumpy neighbor or a friendly neighbor. The best thing to do is to be a little bit less predictable. And that makes sense for this marmot system because they live in a very unpredictable world. Their most important thing is to be able to track conditions like disease and predation and the resource availability and respond to those accordingly. And why does this matter? Well, being flexible is really important even for animals that aren't even that social. So, as the climate keeps getting weirder and more and less predictable, this plasticity might become even more important for both marmots and other systems. So that is a little bit of the work that I'm doing, and now I'm going to turn it over to Katie so that she can share some of the really cool research that she's doing as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. That was really interesting. I did know most of that information already, but I hope everyone else learned something new. Um, cool. All right. Cool. So like Taylor said, she studies more about like the internal state of marmots. I kind of study what impacts them on the outside. So I study kind of the environment and people's influence on marmots. So, as we all know, and we've been talking about, marmots are all around us in Colorado. We can see them on mountaintops, and I saw other people talking about golf courses. In this way, they're capable of living in environments that are both completely natural, but also those that are completely surrounded by people. And living near people has its own challenges. Marmots are known to crawl into cars and get driven away. I know other people were talking about that in the comments as well. We've actually had a marmot get taken accidentally all the way to Arizona in a car. It was okay. Don't worry. And this marmot in the photo is also okay. And in a similar sense, there's a lot of risk involved in living near people. Dogs are often perceived as predators by marmots, and marmots crossing the road while dispersing away from their birth colony could get hit by cars too. And so, because of these unique threats, it's possible that marmots change how they behave to counteract this increased risk. We know a lot of the ways that marmots change the behaviors in response to their environments. So, for example, we know that they're more vigilant when of predators when vegetation is higher, since they can't see their surroundings well. And marmots in more extreme environments where the snow lasts later in the season typically have a shorter window of time to get fat, and so they might prioritize foraging instead of actually looking for those predators. But very little work has actually been done on how marmots respond to changes in their environments that are specifically caused by people. Marmots rely on a lot of visual cues to detect predators and to communicate. They typically live on these steep, rocky slopes where they can see a large area of the landscape. But for marmots that live in developed environments, that's not always possible. So buildings do a really good job of obstructing visibility, which could potentially impact the way marmots navigate their environments. So if individuals can't see their surroundings well, that could have implications for avoiding predation or communication. And so I was curious whether marmots compensate for these disturbances by changing their anti-predator behaviors and by altering their social relationships. And so to do so, I collected data around Rumble and leveraged our long-term data set on both anti-predator and social behaviors. And I used both observations and trapping to measure individual perceptions of risk and social connectivity. I'll talk more about these types of methods in a minute. So to look at how human development impacts these behaviors, I used remote sensing data and LiDAR imagery. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and it's a really cool technique to analyze the topography or like the layout of the landscape. So essentially a plane or a drone with a large sensor flies back and forth over an area and sends a signal to the ground. And that signal bounces back and hits the sensor, and the instrument can measure how much time it took for that signal to return. And in doing so, it can measure the height of objects off the ground. So that could be down to a few meters or even a few centimeters if you have really high resolution data. And so you can get a really accurate three-dimensional picture of a landscape. So I used LiDAR imagery that had been collected by Rumble to map out the terrain of my colony sites in a software called ArcGIS Pro. And this is what that looks like. So the white represents objects like trees or buildings. In the smack dab in the center, you can see the Gothic town site where we work. It's all of those rectangles. So those are like the elevations of the buildings off the ground. And then like the trees, which might be a bit taller than the buildings, are also in bright white. I also collected GPS points of frequently used burrows across my colonies, so that I could run some sort of visibility analyses with these data. So for both of the studies that I'll be talking about today, I looked at how built structures change visibility using multiple techniques to analyze the built environment. So the broader question I asked was, do marmots change their behaviors in disturbed, low visibility environments where people are and where they have low visibility? So for my study on anti-predator behavior, I measured the amount of the terrain that marmots could see within 10 meters of their burrows. And that allowed me to measure how visibility in the periphery of marmot burrows influence how they perceive risk. And I used that to look at 4 different anti-predator behaviors: vigilance while foraging, flight initiation distance, alarm calling propensity, and maximum running speed. I predicted that these behaviors might change to reflect an increase in fear because predators might be able to stalk marmots more effectively if there's built structures obstructing their visibility. And overall, I found that most anti-predator behaviors don't actually change in these developed low visibility environments, but anti-predator vigilance did increase under disturbance pressure. So marmots essentially become more vigilant during their foraging bouts in disturbed low visibility colonies. And that's super important to know because we know that marmots directly trade off the amount of time they spend being vigilant with the amount of time they spend foraging. So if marmots are being more vigilant in these areas, they're foraging less. Marmots hibernate every winter, as Taylor mentioned, and so gaining enough mass over the growing season is super important for surviving that hibernation period. So if we're seeing them changing their foraging patterns because of human development, there might be longer term consequences, including maybe changes in their likelihood of surviving the winter. And as for sociality, I wanted to look at how marmots' social relationships change based on a social group's proximity to development. So for this study, I looked at whether marmots occupying different burrows had a line of sight to one another and whether buildings obstructed their views of one another, and assessed how that influenced both individual and group level connectivity. So within a group, an individual has a position, kind of what Taylor was talking about, related to who that individual interacts with and how frequently it interacts with its group mates. We use observations of social behavior, like we mentioned before, to understand an individual's influence on the rest of its group, and how important it might be for information transfer. And then at the group level, we use these observations to look at group structure. So how are these individual connections distributed across a group? Is there one individual who's most central, or is influence spread evenly across the group? And these are all different measures of connectivity that help us understand the dynamics of sociality within our system. And because sociality and social connectivity can change from year to year, marmots are super useful for assessing how different environmental conditions can influence these behaviors. Because marmots have to travel across burrows to socialize and share information, I predicted that individual and group level connectivity would be lower for groups in disturbed environments. Essentially, marmots would interact with fewer other marmots, and when they did interact, those connections between individuals would be weaker. So ultimately, I found that individual connectivity wasn't really impacted by the built environment and visibility, but group structure was. So individuals might be well adapted to living in disturbed environments, and so don't really significantly change their positions within their networks. But small behavioral changes at the level of the individual might accumulate across a group, and so we see strong differences in connectivity at the group level. So in short, I found that groups became less connected, but also less fragmentable, which meant that individuals interacted with fewer other group mates, but the connections that they did have became stronger. And for marmots, we know that less fragmentable groups are actually known to have a higher likelihood of surviving hibernation, which means that human development might have indirect consequences for survival, which is pretty important and could be pretty cool. So what's next for me? I have found that the built environment can affect marmot behavior, and we know that those behaviors generally have consequences for survival. So in the coming months, I'll be combining the results of these 2 studies to see whether human disturbance plays an indirect role in changing population sizes across our colonies. So essentially, by impacting behavior, can built structures indirectly change survival? And if they can change survival, will that predict changes in population size? And I'm hopeful that the results of this study will be useful for understanding the long-term impacts of human disturbance on wildlife populations. And in general, like we've been talking about, marmots are a really great model system for studying behavioral trends. They share many of their behaviors with other prey species and other social species. And the massive amount of data that we've collected over the last 20 years allows us to make really strong inferences about how characteristics of the environment shape their behavior. So in that way, this work can be really useful for making inferences about how other species might respond to human disturbance, which could benefit their wildlife management in human-modified environments. Before I end here, I wanted to bring up a project that is sort of tied to the work that I do. My lab is currently running a Fat Marmot Week, where you can vote for your favorite fat marmot. And like I said earlier, marmots have to gain enough mass during the summer to survive hibernation, which means they can get huge and really funny looking by this time of year. So if any of you would be interested in voting, you can check out our website. This is happening from August 24th to the 29th. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you learned something new today.
Thank you, Katie. I really was glad you brought up Fat Marmot Week because I was going to bring that up too. And so, yeah, so we got to find some way to celebrate these cute little animals in our life. I'm impressed with you guys' research and your passion in this, and your explanation to everybody. Um, Looks like we have a few more questions that were in the chat that didn't quite get answered. So, like, what percentage of a colony doesn't typically survive the winter?
Okay, yeah, I can go ahead and take that. So hibernation is really, really rough on this species. It can be up to 50% in a really bad year, sometimes even more in a worse year. Katie might know a little bit more about what this year's stats were like. I know it was a very rough snow year on the marmots, but it's a rough, it's a time when a lot of them, I mean, you think about it, it's about half of the year. So, there would already be a high amount of mortality during half of the year. But during these incredibly harsh conditions, yeah, it does tend to be a significant percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can add on that. So this year in particular, so if any of you live in areas that have a lot of snow, I'm sure you noticed that you didn't have a lot of snow this year. Gothic, where we work, was hit especially hard. Like it was like the lowest amount of snowpack like in history for like our area. So we had this like hypothesis that the snowpack that we have actually insulates the ground. And so like marmots aren't actually experiencing the air temperature outside because the snow is like basically a blanket over their burrows. And this past year, because there wasn't any snow for like a good portion of the season, like normally we get in and there's snow covering everything. We walked in and like the grass was already growing. It was kind of insane. Um, they didn't have that layer, and so they were shivering more, they were exerting more energy, and so a lot of them died over the winter because they didn't have that like extra fat reserve that was stored to keep them alive. And so we had about 160 animals at the start of the end of last season. This season we started with about 60, so we lost about 100 animals, which is like a huge, massive die off. So that's kind of something that we wanted to highlight with like the Fat Marmot Week stuff. But in general, it's been kind of rough, having like a smaller season this year. But they bounce back, and we're hopeful that the extra time that they've gotten to forage because of how early the snow melted will help them get extra fat and have lots of extra fat on them for next winter.
Yeah, interesting. And I see, Taylor, you answered the question about volunteers. So yeah, so what's that kind of process that you guys go through to get volunteers in this?
That's a great question. We often have people reach out to either, like team members like us, or even directly to our advisor, Dan Blumstein. The volunteering process is a lot of fun. It's very exciting. It is a lot of hard work, of course, like all field work is. But it's, basically it's a lot of paperwork, making sure that you're, have all of your licensing stuff, because we do want to make sure that these animals are in safe hands. So we make sure that people do trainings to make sure that they can properly handle animals and do things in a way that is appropriate for research. But then the actual volunteering is, like what Katie's doing out right now, except that she's the grad student version of it, of being out there in the field, trapping the marmots, helping give them names, doing a lot of observations. It's very hands-on work. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that for future years.
Great, yeah. Okay, this is kind of more a complicated one. Do you have data on soil composition, types of soil the marmots burrow in, like clay, sand?
Really good question. We do not take that data. That would be really interesting. We don't really look at the burrows themselves in a lot of our work. Like I think our advisor has tried to put like a camera down to see how like the burrows are distributed, but like we really don't study that because it is really hard to like analyze how the burrow system works and where things go. So we don't really look at like that kind of environmental thing, but that's a great question.
Yeah. Well, and then the next one kind of goes with just their environment. Like how much impact are you seeing from climate change and, warming climate, things like that?
We're seeing a very, very significant amount in Gothic. So I completed my third field season last year, but my first field season was, I think, 2022 or 2023. And in Gothic, we were skiing over cabins, which was a high snow year, but not completely out of bounds. And so April 17th is the same day that we ski in every single year. And we cross country ski in because the road is closed up to Gothic. And, it was an incredibly high snow year and it was snowy well into June, right? My understanding is that this year the road was plowed and Katie and the team walked in. There was no snow. Not because the road was plowed, but simply because there was already enough, so little snow that the road was capable of being plowed and safe to walk on. And so these marmots have seen incredibly like very quick changes to their environment. And there's also been in the last 3 years, an incredible increase in drought. So we're on kind of this monsoon system where come July we have incredible amounts of rain and fast storms come in, and that's something that frankly I never even got to see. The last big monsoon season that happened was the year before I arrived, and it hasn't happened since.
Hmm. Interesting. Thank you. So, and then now about the next question is their life cycle. How many babies do they typically have? How long is average lifespan?
Yeah, so marmots, so it's kind of funny. It's not that funny. Marmot, the average lifespan of a marmot is one. Just because the pups all like Taylor said, it's like 50% mortality. And so we do see like most animals don't make it past their first birthday, but if they do, that's great. The maximum that we've ever had in age is 16. So like they are relatively lived rodents. But we typically don't see that very often. Like most of the animals within our study are maybe between like 2 and 6 or 7 years old. Um, what was the other question? I totally forgot.
I think yeah, it's, how many babies, but then Taylor answered
Oh,
that. Usually about 8 to 12.
great. Mhm.
Is
Yeah,
that
we
right?
account for 8 to 12. They can have between like they can have one, they can have like so many. They like we'll just essentially we try and count them as they come out. And so like one day we'll see one pup pop out, and then we'll see another pup pop out, and then we'll see another one, and we're just counting until we like feel like we've caught as many as possible. There was a time this season where we thought we had four at one spot, and then I was trying to track them so we could identify them, give them their ear tags, and like kind of get a sense of how many there were. And then I caught seven that day, and then we caught another like six a couple days later. So they're kind of all over the place in size, and sometimes they have these things called mixed litters where like multiple females have litters in the same places, and so then all the individuals are like mixing up together. We don't know whose is whose. But that leads to us having like over a dozen pups in one spot. So it's really variable.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so now I have one about so on the East Coast or Midwest, they have what they call woodchucks. I know in Texas where I grew up, we had prairie dogs, right? So and it says these are, I guess, in the marmot family. How similar or different are they compared to the marmots you've been describing?
That is a great question. So marmots are one large kind of family with a lot of species within it. So we study the yellow-bellied marmots, Marmota flaviventer, which are pretty regional specific to the Rocky Mountains and surrounding areas. Yellow-bellied marmots also sometimes exist on the West Coast, so they actually are where I'm from, Washington State. We had some growing up in my backyard. But there's also other species such as the woodchuck, such as groundhogs. Those are all different species of marmot that are relatively similar in terms of life history, of where they live, things like that. But they actually have very different patterns, especially socially. So yellow-bellied marmots are some of the least social marmots that exist. Related again to other ground squirrels and things like prairie dogs and things like that. Prairie dogs are a little bit more distantly related, have very different body patterns and things like that, and also have a much higher order of social structure.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's interesting.
I would add on to that just like a simple, not so all groundhogs are marmots, but not all marmots are groundhogs. Like marmots is like the broad name for like all of these different species.
Hmm. Got it. Okay, when do they give birth?
Yeah, so marmots, they aren't so like when you think of bears, like they give birth during like their quote unquote hibernation. But marmots actually only start to mate after they've emerged from hibernation. So they mate in like April, early May. And after that, it's about 40-day gestation period, and then they give birth in their burrows, and then about a month later, those marmots, the pups, emerge from the burrows, and we get to see them. They're really small. They're like that big. Now they're about this big. They're kind of insane, but yeah, they grow really, really fast.
Fun. Okay, we have a tech question. What trail cams have you found that work best in your field if you use those?
That's a great question. I have one right here because I'm in the lab. I don't remember the brand. We don't use anything super fancy just because it's expensive.
Mhm.
But these do the job well. So if you see one with the deer logo on it, that's what it is.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. Look next questions. Is there a correlation to the time of year they go into hibernation and the type of winter or spring we may have?
That is a really great question. I was looking at this, Erin. I've actually
Mhm.
heard the same thing from my family in Eastern Washington, which is I remember my parents telling me there it was like a day in November and they're like, we just saw a marmot, thought of you. And I'm like, that marmot should not be awake right now. That marmot should be asleep. So I think that there is something interesting. There might be a different kind of life history plan for animals that live at much lower elevations or, in less alpine environments. Um, as far as we are able to tell, they're we haven't looked at like the predictive abilities of when they go into hibernation. So we're not looking directly at like, all right, they went to sleep on October 1st and it's going to be this type of winter or whatever. They do have some seasonal, influences. So if they have less food available faster, then they're going to go to sleep faster. If they have a lot of, if they have a really good summer and are able to stock up, maybe they'll go to sleep faster. But we haven't really looked in terms of what does that mean for the upcoming year. So maybe we need to look into that next.
Yeah, good future research. Okay, now another one. It says we see them way up high when there seem to be just rocks. What do they eat up there?
It's a great question. I would wonder the same thing. Marmots typically eat flowers, so I would imagine they can't really survive in places that don't have the proper nutrients. So you might not see the flowers around, but they know where they are, and so they're moving around. They don't typically go too far from their burrows, so maybe they have a cool burrow system where they go back and forth to flower populated areas.
Hmm, good, thank you. Okay, and when is the average date they hibernate? And is there a specific body mass percentage increase that allows them a higher survival?
That's a great question. I don't know in terms of actual like body mass percentage. That's not something that we weigh them, but we don't always look at like the percentage just because they grow so fast. We usually see marmots starting to go into hibernation by the time we exit the field, which is around mid-September. And they're usually all completely, underground, going to sleep by mid-October. But we can have a good prediction on whether they're going to survive or not based off of their measurements. So for small animals like pups, we know we want them to be, at least 2 kilograms, at least if they have a decent shot at surviving, versus the big males, if they're like upwards of 7, they're probably going to be fine. So when we catch them at their lowest, the adults are going to be somewhere between 3 and 4 kilograms, meaning that they are doubling their body weight over the course of the summer. So I'm not 100% sure what that would be body mass percentage, but we have a good idea of how much each one should weigh relative to kind of what stage of life it's in.
Yeah,
Interesting. Thank you.
marmots can the pups, this is a fun fact, they can grow up to 300% of their body weight in a season. Like what I was saying, they're literally like this big, you can hold it in one hand and you can see all the dye on my hands. And then they get to like I don't know, like this big by the end of the season. It's like absurd. Like we can't hold them anymore. And so they grow really fast. We do actually know that there's like a threshold for pups. I don't know too much about it, so I won't speak too much on it, but it's basically like there's like a peak where like they gain this much mass and they're like optimal for hibernation, whereas like the adults, it's like no matter how much you gain, like the more you gain, the better. Like there is no limit on how fat you can be. And so like that works out for them very well. We do have some huge, huge animals this year.
Yeah. That is so interesting. Your guys' passion and your excitement for this really comes through in, teaching everything. So, um, thank you for that. I noticed that Christy shared the so you should listen to, I don't know how to say this word, Ologies interview of Dr. Dan Bloomstein. about this team's research.
Yeah,
So,
it's a
oh, I can't hear you, Christy. You're muted. Try again, Christy. You're muted.
sorry about that.
There we
Yeah,
go.
it's Ologies, and it's a great podcast, a science-based podcast. And so that's how I found Katie. And Taylor was hearing this episode from Dr. Bloomstein that they work with at UCLA. And so I reached out to them, and here you are. So thank you for that. It's fantastic.
Yeah, great. Okay, one last question here. So, what is the average weight you see for surviving adult females going into hibernation?
I would say it's a good question. At least 4 kilograms, 4.5 kilograms. Uh, some of them can get really big. Like it's hard to compare them with the males. Or it's hard to like distinguish them from the males in that sense. But you can kind of tell like the males are a bit bigger than the females.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
interesting.
also does depend on if they reproduced that year. So the reproductive females have to spend a lot of their body energy and body mass on, having babies and nursing them. So they tend to get to like, will feel more comfortable if they get up to 4.5, 5 kilos. But the ones that don't reproduce, like Katie says, are able to kind of be up and at it with the big boys, with the males.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the last follow-up question here, like, maybe a little bit gruesome, but for marmots that die in the winter, are they left in the burrows? Or are they found by scavenger species? Kind of what happens there?
They are left in the burrows. So the burrows are filled to the brim with marmot bones, unfortunately. It is gruesome. They sometimes will get, cleaned out by, over, spring cleaning a little bit. There are scavenger species that might come in, but honestly, if there are still marmots living in that burrow, which is pretty common, then there probably haven't been any foxes or scavengers coming through.
Yeah, this is a skull because I'm in the lab. I can show this of like a marmot that might have been cleaned out from a while ago. We just find like little pieces of jaws and like little bones here and there, and we collect them sometimes. But a lot of the time we just leave them. So
Yeah, interesting. Well, Christy, do you want to add anything else or questions that you felt like you need to
It
bring up?
looks like you guys did a great job of getting all the questions in the chat. So that was impressive because they were coming fast and furious. But I think of all the webinars that Wildware has hosted over the years, I think this is my favorite. I love your presentations. I love your enthusiasm. And I think you covered a lot of bases of information about your work, which is fascinating, and also about marmots, how they act and what challenges they have. And of course, living less than a mile from a marmot, yellow-bellied marmot colony, it's just really fun to learn more about them. So I just want to thank you and all of you who attended. We had 53 people, which is awesome. So
Yeah.
I'll turn it back to you, Laura. Thank you.
Thanks. And to clarify, are you guys doing your research in California or in here in Colorado? There was a side question that was just sent to me.
Great
In
question.
California?
Our lab is based in
Yeah.
California, but the research that we actually conduct is in Colorado, so it's kind of a half time there, half time in LA.
Yeah. And how come you have that both that you're doing?
Mostly because the lab resources where we can process a lot of our data and like use the genetic sampling and stuff are based in LA, but the actual marmots live in Colorado.
Yeah. Cool. Interesting. Well, we really appreciate your time today and sharing your research and the preparation you did for today. It was really fascinating, interesting, and like I said, your passion just comes through and it's contagious. So like I want to go out and learn more about these. I know we'll send a follow-up email to all the people that came today with barring any technical difficulties with this video, as well as I'm thinking we need to put a few of the follow-up links in the email as well. So I'll confirm that with Katie and Taylor. And I have my final thing here. Just thank you. Remember wildaware.org. Come check us out too for questions, especially for those of you that are in Colorado. And we're so glad to have shared this with everybody today. So it's been quite a lot of fun. So thank you.
yeah, thank you guys for coming. Hope you learned something new. And thank you
Yeah,
for having us.
we'll make sure we put all of your stuff too, so people can go to your research and that in the email too, so we can follow up with you. So thank you. All right, well, have a lovely week, everybody, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks
All
so
right,
much,
thank you, Katie. Thank you,
everybody.
Taylor. All right, bye-bye.